I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Ivy Grant from Twilio. Ivy is the SVP of Strategy and Operations at Twilio and leads strategic planning, enterprise analytics, and M&A integration for the organization. She drives transformational initiatives to improve Twilio's operations, and she's just done phenomenal work across her experience both at Twilio and at prior organizations like McKinsey, Edelman, PwC, and Ralph Lauren, I just heard earlier. Ivy's going to be sharing the Twilio stories on metrics and magic and how they've transformed Twilio with OKRs. So please give a warm welcome to Ivy. You're welcome.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm so happy to be here. We're going to talk a lot about culture today, and I know that I heard from someone that some of your conversations yesterday were about culture, but how many of you in this audience have a culture in your organization that you would describe as a startup culture? Ooh, one in the back, a couple over there. A small number of us. How many of you might work at large organizations that have they identify as a startup? They have startup sort of actions and behaviors, even though we're older. You're further along the maturity curve. So that's where I want to talk a little bit about Twilio. So Twilio has been, I oftentimes describe it as a teenage company because, teenagers have minds that are still very young and vibrant, but they've got bodies that are sort of growing into maturity and adulthood. And sometimes you're talking to them in that adult body and you realize this person's a kid, right? Their feet are really big and they're tripping over them on their way places. They're getting hairy, but they don't seem like adults, right? So I want to talk a little bit about the culture of startups and how we sort of become more mature organizations and how Workboard helped us sort of along that maturity curve. The agenda for this is, one, we're going to just set the stage. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Twilio. It's not a marketing pitch, I promise. Tell you a little bit about Twilio and sort of how we operate. Next, we're going to talk about how we sort of started to embrace the OKR, the magic of OKRs, because our culture is called the Twilio magic. And then how we operationalized. Okay, so just one quick point. My family thinks I work for Twitter. So some of you, every time I'm at a barbecue, my aunt says, "What's it like working for that Elon Musk guy?" And I'm like, I don't know who you're talking about. So I'm going to explain what Twilio is. Many of you might have worked at, are any Twilio customers in the audience? You might not even know you're a Twilio customer, but let's talk a little bit about what Twilio does. Twilio is a customer engagement platform. And what we do is we create personalized experiences for our brands, and those brands then ensure that those personalized experiences for their customers really work to engage the customer, to know the customer intimately, and to be able to help those customers convert based on that personalization. And how does that work? The easiest example of Twilio that many of you have probably touched already, anyone use rideshare apps? Okay. So the first interaction you have with the rideshare app when you first set up your ride, what happens? You get a text message. And that text message says, "Here's Julio, your driver. Here's his license plate number." It might also share with you a little bit of information like, if you are going to get into the car, make sure that the license plate in that car is the same as the one that I have in the app, just so you don't get happily kidnapped or unhappily kidnapped. And the third thing might be you might get another email or text message in your phone that says, and we'll wait 8 minutes for you, or 3 minutes for you, or 5 minutes for you before we start charging you, or before we start to tell. So that first interaction you get is via text message. And sometimes during that interaction, you might also have to make a call. Maybe you're in a crowd, you can't figure out where your driver is, and you have to make a phone call. And so you do it in the app. You press the little phone button. All of those interactions, the SMS interaction, that phone interaction, 90% of the time, if you're on a ride-sharing app, that's Twilio. Twilio provides the underlying infrastructure that allows you to create those communications. So we work directly with the carriers. We manage the traffic. We figure out how to run those on routes. You don't have to worry about it. We encrypt it for you. You don't have to worry about it. If you are a customer, All you do is drop in a few lines of code, and those pieces work for you. So we manage complexity. We manage complexity for our customers, but we also have a lot of complexity internally. So Twilio grew really rapidly. Our founder, Jeff Lawson, had a group of people who literally sat at a restaurant and on the back of a pizza box wrote out the founding principles of the company. And so in that growth pattern, we've grown a lot of different ways. One, lots of new channels, OTT channels, WhatsApp, bringing on lots of new experiences for customers. But also, we grow a lot inorganically. We bought a lot of companies, a lot of companies. One of my roles is M&A integration, and when I first joined and started to manage the M&A integration team, we were integrating 5 companies of varying sizes, some of them small, but we also did our big Segment integration in 2020, and Segment was a massive multi-billion-dollar influx for us. So when you have a company that's got startup energy, but that company has also grown inorganically, meaning we've got a lot of new organizations coming in. Oftentimes, you end up with a lot of siloed pieces of organization, siloed activities, and things where you're trying to work across a variety of things that aren't well integrated yet. And so on that platform of multiple kinds of integration and inorganic growth, we're also growing rapidly in terms of the size of the business. So to give you a little context, Twilio runs 14 trillion transactions a year. To put some context to that, our credit card users, who has a Visa card in their wallet right now? Visa, per year, runs 250 billion payment transactions per year. And they are the largest credit card operator, credit card processor in the United States. Visa, 250 billion. We run 14 trillion transactions, phone calls we manage, et cetera. And the interesting thing is, probably 80 to 85% of the phones in the United States, we have touched in some way. Through email, managing an email from a brand to you, through text messaging, through voice, we have touched your phones. So the managing of the kind of complexity that you have to do to run an operation of this size, an operation that has to be always on 24/7, an operation that if your rideshare app goes down in the middle of the night and you are stranded somewhere at an airport and you can't get home, the kinds of calls that your brand will get from you will only rival the kinds of calls that we get from brands, right? So the management of this is incredibly complex. And so we do it all on the basis of the Twilio magic. The Twilio magic is our culture and our values, and we have 4 different principles. We are builders. We like to build things. We like to innovate. We like to figure out what's cool and put things on top of it. We like to build. We are owners. So we like to hold things and take them from end to end, from idea to ideation, to design, to execution. We are all about that ownership path. We are curious. We are very, very interested in what's going on around us and how to incorporate that into the things that we are building and owning. And we are positrons. Yes, we made that up. But, well, positrons are an actual, scientific term. Misa's a rocket scientist. She'll tell you about that later. But we are positrons in the way that we believe in the power of possibilities. And so you stir all that up together. The interesting thing is, it's actually a fairly, what are the things that are missing from that magic that you don't hear? One of the things you don't hear is, we collaborate well. We build interoperable and integrated approaches. We have a lot of great things about our magic, but not all of them are really great for sort of assessing and driving strategy in a collaborative way. A lot of it is about the autonomy of a person who is owning and building and pushing towards a goal. And so those are some of the kinds of cultural changes that we had to overcome as we thought about entering into the OKR space. So let me tell you a little bit about Twilio. There's before OKRs and there's after OKRs. So let's talk a little bit about Twilio before OKRs. The first part was we used to set goals with a process called BPMs. BPMs is totally made up, okay? Our CEO, who was also an engineer, liked to create things. He liked to innovate. He liked to build. And so what he did was, OKRs are for suckers. What we need is a process that is uniquely Twilio, a process called BPMs, big picture, priorities, measures. So 3 different levels. And he loved to talk about the lore of the fact that he built our BPM repository himself. He coded it. And he built it over a weekend. I mean, what's Workboard doing, putting in all this R&D work? He built it over a weekend. Easy breezy. Now, it didn't have any functionality, okay? It was just a repository where people would stick things in, and then they would forget about them for the rest of the year, and then we'd come back and we'd write over what we wrote before. So the first process was, how do we get ourselves out of this BPM process that really doesn't work? It doesn't work for a couple of different reasons. One, it was more of a storytelling process. This big picture thing was more like you had to tell a story about what you were building and why it was important. It wasn't focused, it wasn't measurable, but it was great storytelling. The second thing was it was very bottom up. So every team would build an OKR, build a BPM, and then put it in the repository. And if you wanted to know how they were doing against it, there was no facility for that. You just had to you could read them and then you have to call people. So that process we wanted to get away from. Second of all, again, lots of autonomous team-based decision making. So has anyone heard of the 2 pizza team? 2 pizza teams? Okay. So it's a little bit of an artifact of Amazon, where our former CEO worked briefly. And it's basically like you don't build any teams, particularly for development, for product development. You don't build any teams bigger than can eat 2 pizzas together. I don't know if they're like men eating pizza, because that's like, they could eat like 17 pizzas. I don't know if they thought about women, but the teams have to be small enough that that 2 pizzas could feed them. So 4 people, 5 people, 6 people to a team. And we did a lot of small team builds. So 2 small teams that would go out and, again, end-to-end own a process and deliver it and execute it. But that didn't mean that they necessarily were doing things in a particularly secure way or against certain sets of standards, or it was they owned it and they would drive towards it. And that created a culture that was super autonomous, super decision-making, but lots of activity, but not anything that sort of led towards a shared set of goals. So being able to overcome that kind of DNA was very challenging. And finally, we had a functional org structure. And that functional org structure was primarily sales, and then product, and then underneath it, 2 very different setups of organization. So you've got basically a matrix. On the product side, you've got all of our individual business lines: messaging, voice, email, segment, which was our CDP product. Then on the other side, you had sales that was set up by customer segment and geo. And somewhere betwixt the 2 was a very morass of overlapping matrix that we never actually put in place any real governance around. So trying to get those guys to plan together was really, really challenging. So we've got super autonomous organization that likes to build, likes to own, but doesn't necessarily like to collaborate. We've got a functional structure that doesn't necessarily serve us. And we've got this culture of BPMs where when new people came in, they said, what is a BPM? And you were telling them you have to describe the big picture. And they're like, well, I don't know how to do that. You have to act it out. It has to be more like interpretive dance. So then we began to embrace OKRs. And I'll say first that I mentioned this to Deirdre earlier. When we started the process of OKRs, it started actually 3 years ago. We brought Workboard in and said, we've got to get our act together for planning. We got to figure this out. Workboard, you guys talk to Jeff Lawson, our CEO. We're going to make this happen. We weren't ready. We weren't ready. We weren't ready for a system because we didn't really even have a good planning process in place. So the very first thing we did when we started embracing OKRs was we spent a year, an entire year, just planning in the OKR methodology and letting people use whatever tool they wanted to actually document it. Excel, Airtable, whatever you wanted to use. You had to use the principles of OKRs, objectives, KRs, but you didn't have to care about the tool. And that year was fantastic because it actually helped us create a little bit of muscle memory in trying to understand how good planning happens. And then the system became an enabler as opposed to being like the thing that pushed the organization to change. The organization had to embrace the change first, and then the system enabled that change to happen. And why did we do it? We wanted focus. All of that bottom-up planning and execution was really challenging because we were building a lot of things, but not necessarily the things we wanted. So, focus, being able to harness all that great energy towards a single set of goals and having those goals be top-down. Second was a common language. So no more big picture storytelling, no more priorities and measures and having people describe those things in whatever way they believed that they were, but having a really structured methodology that people could Google if they needed to and be able to understand how it works. They could read books suddenly as opposed to having to explain it each time. Next is we didn't want to erase the idea of autonomy. When you're coming out of a startup vibe, you want that entrepreneurial energy. You just don't want to run it in 1,000 different directions. You want to push it into one. So the idea that people could have top-down objectives and then let them decide how they get those objectives done through their KRs still allowed us to have the entrepreneurial spirit, and people didn't feel like there was so much process that it was inhibiting their creativity. And last but not least, transparency. One of the first things we did when we implemented our workboard system was give almost everybody in the entire company read-only access. So if nothing else, while we were rolling it out, the people who were going to be working in the system, everybody could see whether or not they were meeting their goals. Everyone could see what those goals were, and everyone could at least share in the excitement of the results-driven process that we were running. Our second big decision, how deep in the organization to go? So we were talking about the levels of organizations. Khozema is our new, we also have a CEO change, so in January, Khozema Ship-Chandler is our new CEO. He's an L0. So anyone that reports to a CEO is an L1, anyone that reports to someone who reports to a CEO is L3, and on and on and on. So we did a phased implementation that took the top layer first. That top layer had been the ones who had been most inundated with the OKR methodology the prior year. And so they were the ones we started with the system, because what they were sharing was what are the big shared goals that as an organization we have, and let's try to act first, like disaggregate those into different teams. And so we started with our big strategic pillars and being able to break them down amongst teams, and that top about 100 people, it's a little bit more than 50, because there's people who sort of enable the process. But that top 100 people were the first people we rolled Workboard out to. And that also allowed us to learn a little bit as we did each phase going downwards. So company OKRs first. We decided to go down all the way to L5 for people to put in team OKRs. And at the time, we sort of took a step back on personal OKRs. We're actually reevaluating that, and we're probably going to be going into personal OKRs for next year. But for this year, it was these 3 phases. And how quickly to move was a big decision for us as well. I mean, we'd been waiting 3 years to be able to get this system in. But now it was like, well, do we do it in 6 months? Do we take 2 years? What do we do? We decided on a 1-year implementation program. And that 1-year implementation, 1 year to some people sounds really short. 1 year to some people sounds really fast. And we liked that interchange because on the one hand, it really gives you a long enough time, 4 straight quarters, to get the OKR methodology ingrained in the rest of the organization. Secondly, it really allowed us through each quarter to learn. And each of those learnings were then reapplied into the way that we rolled out the strategy for the next layer of the organization. So it allowed us to have enough time and feedback sessions. We have a process called Op Week, which is our quarterly business reviews. And during our operating week, we literally ask people, how are we doing on OKRs? Not just your individual performance, but how do you feel like the process is working? And we take feedback and we try to make sure that the next way that we drive them outwards, that feedback is incorporated. And finally, we wanted to move quickly enough that employees got excited about it. And we actually had a lot of that. People would see that other teams had this tool, and they were like, well, when is my team getting it? So we ended up actually shifting some of our implementation process to ensure that we were able to actually get more people into the process earlier. And so this is just a case of our operating rhythm. One interesting thing about this operating rhythm, there's a big green box in the middle that's called executive mid-quarter feedback. We totally made that up, okay? So this is a process that in order to incentivize our individuals who have to manage their OKRs and update them along the way, we wanted them to have some sense of, why should they update them? Why should they keep them updated? Because usually what could happen is towards the end of the quarter, everyone streams in, does a quick update at the end and says, okay, yeah, I finished it. But to make people do it along the way, we had our operating group, our OG, our CEO, our CFO, our CMO, all of them meet mid-quarter, and they would talk about the progress against the quarter, and then they'd go down in the system and they'd talk to people through the system. They'd say, hey, good job on that. That was really great. Love to see that. Or they'd say, this really doesn't look like it's been updated. Do you need help pushing this forward? What do you need? And it maybe was a little bit of stick. Maybe it was a little bit of carrot. But it actually engaged people to the process of, I should be updating my OKRs because I never know when the CEO might ping me through the system and ask me about the project that I'm working on. Because the same way that the entire company has transparency and visibility, the CEO does too. So that was a really good role modeling piece. I think that was helpful for us in success. And we love the fact that this approach really aligned to who we are as people. So we are curious. It really allowed people in that deep enablement to get excited about the fact that this was a flexible process that they were going to be learning through, and to have some pull in the organization for it. In terms of ownership, sending the OKRs, to really made people say, I now own this piece and everyone can see that I own it, so I need to make sure that it's being pushed along. And we are positrons. Look, OKRs are a learning tool. So one of the things that we do to keep things positive is we try not to be really angry when people don't make the full 100% or if they're in yellow. There's no sort of conversation that's you're in yellow and therefore you're bad. But what we try to do is make sure that people are encouraged to be able to figure out what it was that kept them from getting into green and figuring out for the next quarter how they do something different. So, how do we operationalize? My team is the center of the entire corporate universe. Well, no, okay. That's how I feel sometimes. But the corporate strategy and operations team is used to doing these sort of large-scale corporate enablements. We do growth initiatives. So right now we're working on our new transformation strategy. And we also do a lot of operational improvement work. And so this team was perfect to be able to do this in a cross-functional way and also to line up the right people within the organization to support. So that was our communications team who helped us actually build out the process, our HR performance management who are here in the room as well, HR tech who manages the systems, IT who actually manages our integrations as well as making sure that we're completely compliant to the rest of our IT infrastructure rules, and our learning and development who are also here, our learning and development team who helped us to build out the structure of our enablement. And then two other enablers that we found really, really helpful is that we have two big teams, one of which is the strategy execution champions. Now, for those of you in public companies, nobody wants to see the SEC has a question for you. That's not something we are. So we try to make sure we say strategy execution champions versus the SECs. Our accounting guy was like really freaked out about it. So the strategy execution champions are all the people who support each of the teams who have an operating rhythm. They have a chief of staff. They have a head of operations. They have someone who manages the reporting, the planning processes. So we've pulled all those people together in a team. And then we actually had all of them get certified. And then we run a Slack channel, sets of meetings, et cetera, where they get to engage with each other. So the best part about it is, even without us intervening, they're asking each other questions. They're saying, hey, I tried to do it this way, and they're getting answers from each other. So before there's even an escalation to someone for support, they talk to each other. And that's been a huge boon for us. And last but not least, people who weren't even engaged in that process of rhythms and planning, they just were excited about Workboard and wanted to get more involved. We pulled them in and created an OKR champion program so that they can support along the way into their organizations, just to make sure all of this is being enabled and embedded in each organization. So they get a little bit of extra training. They get another Slack channel where they can talk to each other. But we also use them as a communication vehicle into their organizations, since they are usually people who are change leaders. And we use them as a listening mechanism. So 2 great sort of people-driven processes that really helped us to enable. And then how we rolled out was really important to us. We really felt strongly that the methodology mattered more than the system. No offense, Workboard. So we felt like if we ever changed systems, we wanted the methodology of OKRs to be deeply embedded in the bones of the people. So we had a couple of different ways we did that. One, we took people through mandatory sets of classes and engagements, the first one of which was their intro to OKRs, led by yours truly. We recorded it, so I don't have to do it every single time. But they do an overview process with the SVP who kind of walks them through why this is important. And we have all of the accompanying best practice material from Workboard that supports it. Then we have a learn to write OKRs process. These are smaller, facilitated workshops where people can bring their own OKRs and ask questions about them. So we try to use as many real-world examples as possible. And those are facilitated both by our L&D, our learning and development team, and by Workboard. And then last but not least, we have a process where we actually have the SECs involved in helping to write their first Q3 OKRs. So we manage each of these training processes into the rhythm of the business. So the first time that they do it themselves, they're doing it for real in a planning cycle, and they have a person there who can be helpful and who has been certified and who helps them through that process. So this then helps them to be able to live the operating rhythm, and that's when we put in those like midpoint check-ins that make them do certain things. But the process is really about the methodology, and the system, again, is an enabler. The system doesn't, the dog like has to wag the tail doesn't wag the dog. And what we've heard from people is they absolutely love it. And that success has been not just, our success as a corporate strategy team or as an HR team or as an IT team, but that success has been seen throughout the organization, where people are saying that they love the fact that it's created some focus for us. We used to, in terms of BPM language, we would have 10 BPMs that we were working against at once as a corporation. And it was really challenging to understand how all of these things work together. Now we have 3, sometimes 5 big core company metrics that we're driving towards, and we work through those step by step. So that focus is really definitely there. And then people love the transparency of it. They loved being able to go in, even again, when they hadn't been trained yet and they were only in read access, being able to go in and see what the results were, see what the progress was, and see what the big priorities were. I think that was a really helpful process for us. So what are the lessons learned? Okay, one is trust the process. For us, progress over perfection. We knew that this was going to be an iterative process. We knew that we were going to be learning as we went, and we knew that we had the full year to make it happen. So we didn't feel intensely rushed to put something in place that might get turned over or trashed later. We really felt like that process of the progress that we had, and even when we got bad feedback, it was all about what could we do about it later. So I think for us, that progress over perfection was a really important tenet for us. And the second thing is making room for people's emotions. As strategy and operations, we work on a lot of confidential projects. We work on a lot of projects that have to change people's behaviors and mindsets. And this was one of those areas. Change is hard, particularly, again, when you have people who feel fairly autonomous and entrepreneurial and want to do what they want to do. And it is oftentimes easier as an owner to do it all end-to-end yourself without ever having to talk to another team. That's only going to slow you down, right? So we had a lot of organizational culture to overcome. And so people's emotions were engaged. But that's okay, because any strategy and operations leader knows that you're not only a strategist, sometimes you're a psychologist. Sometimes you're a handholder. Sometimes you're a nanny. But the process of change is different for everyone, and so you have to shift through those modes in order to make it happen. So don't be afraid to iterate, but also, like, you will have to manage people's emotions about change. We had a senior executive, I'm not going to say who, but they all know, but a senior executive who the first thing, and she was totally on board with this process, she was so excited about it, and then she was like, oh, I'm never going to open that system. I'm never going to do that. Just train my chief of staff. She'll figure it out, and I'm never going to open it, right? So we had to find ways to overcome that kind of that kind of barrier and obstacle to change. And she was super supportive. Like, she just didn't want to actually do any of those things. She wanted them to happen, but didn't want to actually do them. So the second one is deep enablement is key. I think the process that we created, like I said, that was really founded on the methodology was really important, and taking people through multiple iterations of how they see it from a top down. First, why is this OKR methodology important to you, and how will it change your life in a positive way? Second, let's get into actually creating OKRs and writing them and using your actual goals to be able to do it, so they get a hands-on interaction, and then a guided hands-on interaction in a real-world situation where they get to write their own. So being able to do that set of training processes was really helpful. And secondly, again, really sparking people's curiosity. So we sort of started, once we had that read-only available to everyone, people started literally coming to us and being like, I feel like my team has been left out. I feel like I see other people doing things that I want to do them. And I'm like, we will totally use that energy to start to gain traction in the organization. So all the cool kids are using Workboard. I don't know what you guys are doing. So being able to use that in an entrepreneurial world is really important. And then last but not least, keep the goal in sight. So OKRs have to create focus. They have to create alignment. They have to create accountability. We've said those three words no fewer than 1 million times to our organization. And they love those words because those are things that they want. Even with the entrepreneurial mindset, even with their level of autonomy, ultimately, people, particularly in the tech world, want to build products that customers love. And so being able to deliver that level of focus to tell them, here's what you're telling us that customers love, so we're going to build it together. Being able to get aligned around a future focus is fantastic, particularly when that alignment means it's going to be more integrated collaboration between teams. And finally, the accountability, where we don't place blame, but we do place accountability. And so you're accountable not just to have said, that was me, my bad, I didn't do that correctly, or I won that particular thing and look how great it was, but accountable for being able to say, what have I learned from that process? And then last but not least, the transparency is super helpful in that. So there was usually a thank you slide at the end. So look, we are now on the next part of our journey because we're in the process of actually rolling out a new strategy for Twilio that's going to be a bit more transformative than the strategies had been before. And we're actually super excited that we've done this work already, because now on the platform of people already in the process of understanding how to drive shared goals and objectives, already in the process of using Workboard to help us demonstrate our progress against those, we're going to be able to now install a new strategy in a place where people already have a little bit of muscle memory. So I, for one, am super excited, and I can't wait to see what Twilio builds next. Thank you very much.